Welcome to this special elections edition of 2 Half Hours, where every week we get behind the headlines, break through the spin, and get into the minds of the candidates. With expert analysis and varied points of view, we get beyond all the election hype and jump straight into what's important to you. With Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum locked into a Republican primary election battle that could last into the summer, and President Obama's health care law back on the front page, the campaign season is definitely in full swing. Congressmen Ron Paul and Newt Gingrich are still hanging around, and small parties like the Greens and Libertarians are running spirited campaigns. Joining us here today as we survey the election terrain, we have with us Dr. Michael McDonald of the Brookings Institution, Dr. Tony Michelle Travis of George Mason University, and Mr. Dan Holler of Heritage Action for America. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Great to be here.
I just want to jump right in, and I want to start with healthcare. That seems to be the big thing here this week in the United States. And Mr. Holler, I want to start with you. Now, I want to start with more of a moral question, a fundamental question. Is healthcare a fundamental right? And if you believe it is a fundamental right for Americans, was President Obama's plan the way to go?
I think what everybody agrees on is that the healthcare system in America is broken. It was broken prior to President Obama taking office, and it's still broken. And I think what you see from the healthcare law, from the justices, and from the majority of American people are that they don't like the law that they got. So that's why you're seeing sort of a sweep in 2010 and the elections of 2012 focusing around healthcare and the Supreme Court. And I think what really needs to happen is we need to pull back and realize that when the government gets involved in healthcare decisions, it has a tendency to mess them up. Nobody really has fundamental trust in government. The American people just don't believe the government is capable of doing good things anymore. They've proven time and time again that they're not capable of that. So we need to find a way to empower individuals, empower the patients, empower the doctors, instead of bureaucrats in Washington. And by doing that, you're going to give people better choices, more access to care, which is what pretty much everybody agrees needs to happen.
And Dr. Travis, so healthcare fundamental right is the role of the government, President Obama's plan?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a fundamental right, but in terms of, could be a budget issue. I mean, if we don't do something, as you say, it's broken, it's going to cost more in the long run. Now, maybe this is not the right thing to do, but some version of this probably is.
Well, what are the things that you think are wrong and right about President Obama's plan?
Well, I don't know because it's a 2,000-page bill, and I'm not sure anybody's read it or knows what's in it. But, I think some of the things that are right about it are the provision for those who, with the pre-existing conditions, that they be covered. Given the economy, the children up to age 26, I think it is, can be carried on the parents' health care plan. Those particular provisions, I think, are certainly important. Pushing it down the throats of the states is a big question, whether or not that should be different.
Dr. McDonald, I want to come to you now. So how are you falling on this healthcare issue? Is it something that everyone should have access to? And was President Obama's plan the way to make that happen?
Well, it actually is a fundamental right, because if you are sick and you go to an emergency room, you will be taken care of. And the situation, one of the reasons why the system's broken at the moment, is that those people without health insurance are given care. And there's a premium that's given, that's added on to everybody's health insurance, people who do have health insurance, to cover these people who don't have health insurance. Now, that's not widely understood in this debate. The mandate was to require that these individuals who would otherwise be leeching onto other people's health care insurance to pony up and actually have health insurance so that they are paying their fair share, and everybody not at the expense of everybody else. So, I mean, in that sense, if you show up to a hospital and you seek medical care, you will receive that medical care. It doesn't even matter if you're an illegal immigrant in the country; you will receive that care. So, the question then revolves about how do you go about achieving this delivery of health care for everyone if you are going to deliver it in this manner. I mean, you could just say, if you don't have health insurance, sorry, you're turned away from the hospital and you just need to die. I don't think our society is at that point to do that. But we have a situation where there's a very deep political debate over how do you deliver health care then to everybody in a way that really does manage costs in an effective way and does preserve individual choice for people about how they're going to have their own health insurance.
And I want to follow up on that real quick, and then I want to go back to something that Mr. Holler had said. But, one thing that we see consistently is that Medicare is very popular in America, that the Veterans Administration hospital system gets very, very high marks from those who use it. But then we've seen that this idea of universal coverage or the Obama plan has been something that's been made people a little uneasy. What do you think the difference is there where people are willing to praise government-mandated health care and, the particular guys where they can see it, but then when they see it in the Obama plan, they're like, oh, I'm not sure.
Well, once you have a program, people, initially there's a lot of resistance to that program, so you'll find divisions in the society about whether or not you should proceed with that program. That was how Social Security went forward. A lot of the sort of government programs that we've had over the history of the country have initially had a lot of resistance. But then once people actually participate in the program, they decide they really like the program. So that's where we are with Medicare. And the just fascinating thing in this debate has been people who have Medicare who are against this Obama health care. They already have their health care. They have their government-mandated health care, and they're saying, I want the government out of my health care. They're receiving government health care right there. So they don't even perceive then, because they have so bought into the system and the culture that's associated with that program, that it's even a government-run program when in fact it actually is.
Now, Mr. Holler, I want to go back to you because, one thing you mentioned is people don't have trust in government. And I think perhaps you could say, and certainly the New York Times article that highlighted some of what Dr. McDonald is saying, people who already have Medicare and, want government out of their health care, that they view they're just making the tough choices for what we have to do to our country. How do you respond to that?
Now, I think it's something really interesting when we talk about the previous government programs, whether it's Medicare or Social Security, and we're talking about mandated. These are programs that people, pay into the system, and then they benefit from later, and they can defer enrolling in Medicare or Social Security. They are not forced into those programs. It's a choice that they make, and yes, they pay into it, but they don't necessarily have to go into that. And so I think it's viewed by them as a choice, and I think we can talk broadly about some of the dependency issues that are associated with all of that. But one of the problems I think that separates what the president's health care law is versus these other programs is that it vastly changes the healthcare system as we know it. It mandates change on the entire healthcare law or the healthcare system. So you suddenly have the government saying, these are the types of plans that are going to be allowed in the exchanges. These are the type of procedures through the IPAB board that we may or may not pay for in Medicare. So there is a feeling that the government is forcing these changes upon people. It's not a program where people are going into of their own accord. It's that it's being changed drastically. And that's uncomforting to people. So it's not just that, hey, there's this government program I'm paying into and I can be part of. It is, wow, the government is really radically changing things and I don't know what to make of it. And I think that scares people, especially when distrust of government is so low.
Dr. Travis.
But really, in the 21st century, shouldn't we have a little bit more uniformity across this vast country that we have?
I suppose you could make that argument if you believe that somebody is capable of providing uniformity that works. I mean, that I think is one of the fundamental divides, right? Is that some people, especially here in Washington, think that the smart people can get together and decide what will work across the entire country, whereas other people say, what, states are different, economies are different in various regions, and states and those regions should have the ability to innovate and do different things. So it's very much a sort of centralized and model, where we're going to dictate how all this works so things can be uniform versus a state-by-state model where states can innovate. And, whether it's Utah or Massachusetts, two very different healthcare systems, but, each governor said it works differently for their states and works fine. So, I think that if we're really concerned about getting good quality coverage to people, it should be the direction we go.
Okay, well, let's say, for example, No Child Left Behind. Some states opted out. Are they doing any better than what the federal government was mandating?
This is a good question.
Do we have examples where the states are doing it better? I'm not saying the federal government is doing it that well, but do we have examples on the other side?
Well, I don't know about on the education side, for example, but if you look at Utah and what they've done with their health care program,
it's better.
It is better that people have more choice. And this is the thing that really frustrates me about the president's health care plan, is that it's being billed as, you have all these choices. The reality is that you're either still going to get coverage through your employer, or they're going to dump you because they would rather pay the tax penalty, and you're going to be dumped into the exchange, and you're going to have a narrow, slice of plans you can pick from, because those plans are going to be defined by, whoever's writing the regulations at the Health and Human Services Department. If you contrast that to what federal employees and staffers in Congress get, they open up a book and they have hundreds of health care plans to choose from. They can choose on cost, the benefits, what works for their family. That sort of individual choice is the direction we need to go, not having, a narrowly tailored plans that the people who write laws think will work for all Americans.
Right, and let's understand what the alternative choice is in the Ryan budget that was just passed by the House, is to make Medicare into a voucher program and to manage the cost by not providing full coverage to people through the voucher program for all of the things that they may need. So if you have a costly situation in terms of your health care, you may not be able to fully cover those costs, and thus you may not be able to get the procedure that you need. And so then you have a situation where it's not rationing so much in terms of saying we're going to cover certain procedures. It's a way of rationing by saying we're going to not pay the full amount that you would need for the insurance to cover all of the things that you may need. And some people who have sufficient money can cover themselves, but other people who don't are not. And so you are still making choices. I mean, fundamentally, the different approaches, if we're going to manage these costs, I mean, that's really the bottom line here, is we've got to figure out how to manage these costs. And if you're looking at a healthcare system which continues to outpace inflation by 2 to 3 times inflation level, then you're going to have to look at some cuts someplace. I mean, that's the only other way to do it is somehow to mandate to the health insurance, or really the healthcare industry, to say you have to manage your costs. There are other countries that do that, by the way. There are countries that say there's only a certain amount of medical loss, which they call, for administrative purposes. And we could have taken that route with the health care bill as well, to say we're going to regulate the business instead of try and force everybody into the health care system. And those countries have much lower costs associated with their delivery of their health care, because they're regulating the delivery of it in that manner. So one way or another, either we're going to have to think about how do we get everybody into the system, and still at some point it's going to be rationing of some sort because the costs are out of control, or we look at the businesses and say we're going to have to regulate you to control your costs and the escalation that we're seeing in the costs.
Well, is that sort of regulation, and I think this is sort of maybe the interesting piece of this, is we're talking sort of on both sides of potential rationing one way or the other in sort of different guises. Why has free health care, single payer, which was something that was in there, why has that not really entered into the argument? I mean, that seems a way to get everyone into the system and certainly rationalize some of these administrative costs.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. I mean, someone's got to pay for the health care. Right. There have to be taxes if you're going to have the system. It doesn't just spring out of nowhere. And every other country that has health care for all of its citizens has some sort of system where the government is providing that based on taxes. So again, it's either you have to control the costs or you have to get everybody into the system. But you still, in either aspect, you're still going to have some costs associated with the programs.
And here's the really scary thing to me. If you go back to the Medicare example for just a minute, and you look at primary care providers, 1 in 3 primary care providers are already limiting the number of Medicare patients that they're accepting. So the sort of single payer model that we have in the U.S. being Medicare, for this narrow segment, their choices are already limited because doctors don't get reimbursed enough to make it worth their while. 1 in 8 primary physicians just outright refuse to take Medicare patients. And if you go down trying to control cost on the doctor side of things, those numbers are only going to grow, and that's going to mean for seniors longer wait times, longer travel times, and less care. So when you talk about single payer, we already have experience with that in the U.S. and some of the people who have Medicare are very happy with the coverage, others are not. But we can already see the effect it's having on the care side.
And let me just say this, sort of maybe to frame this argument a little bit, because there's a lot of heat and light around the healthcare debate. But in particular, I mean, we know this was big in 2008. But do you actually really see healthcare, I mean, beyond the Supreme Court hearings and everything we're hearing with that, becoming an issue in this campaign?
I think it will be one way or the another. I think what the Obama administration, sort of the doomsday scenario where the entire law is struck down, the individual mandate and everything else, that's a doomsday scenario as far as their domestic achievement goes. But from a campaign perspective, it refocuses everything on what are the Republicans' plans. And President Obama will be forced to provide his alternative to what got struck down. But it will really refocus, and I think you'll have a replay of 2008. And interestingly, you might have President Obama adopt his position that he took when he was running against Hillary Clinton, which is that you can't do an individual mandate, you can't do that to people. So he may very well recycle his 2008 primary legislative strategy on health care.
Dr. Travis.
Well, both parties will have to reposition. I mean, Obama says, well, you've rejected mine, and they'll find people who would have benefited if they'd used it, and the Republicans then they're put in the position of saying, well, what would you do differently? So they have to come up with something. But honestly, listening to the news just before the show, I'm not so sure international issues won't overshadow a number of domestic priorities, healthcare being one.
For sure. Dr. McDonald, what's your take?
Well, it's already an issue. So, I mean, it's been an issue ever since the whole policy debate was initiated by the administration. It loomed very large in the 2010 elections. Either way of what happens here, regardless of the Supreme Court's action, it's going to continue to be an issue because it's an issue that concerns the American people. Either way, I mean, we're still going to have either people who are against it or we're going to have people for it, and they're going to want a solution to this problem. But I'll agree with Dr. Travis in saying that, look, the number one issue isn't going to be health care. It's going to be the state of the economy. That's ever since we've been doing survey research and looking at at how people decide, there are few rare instances where foreign policy issues, if we're at war, and actually like Vietnam or something along those lines, that those sort of international issues can trump domestic issues. But by and large, it's the economic issues that are that weigh most on people's minds.
Well, while we're talking about the economy and rationing, to maybe take it back to the bad old days, I want to say something about gas prices as we get into the economy because that seems to be the big focus. I saw a poll just the other day, 71% of Americans now say that the rising gas prices is causing hardship for them economically. So, Mr. Holler, I want to start with you. Is President Obama to blame for the high gas prices?
There's actually a new poll out today that said 84% of families have had to change their daily habits because of gas prices. This is one of those issues that people in Washington try to personalize issues all the time. This is one of those issues that don't need to be personalized because you see it driving to work every day, and every time you fill up your car, you see the gas prices going up. I think we have to acknowledge that the president's ability to have an immediate impact on prices are limited. One of the things that he can do, if he truly believes speculators are the problem, which he has claimed in the past, what he could do in that regard is make a signal to the world markets that he is going to, open up American supplies of oil and begin exploration as quickly as possible. That would signal to the speculators that he demonizes on a regular basis that, hey, we can't keep doing this. I don't think speculators are the big problem, but if he was serious about it, he could be doing that. And there are a couple other things he can do directly on gas prices, though. One is the U.S. has this, collection of boutique fuel standards, these summer blends. So we have cleaner blends in the summer to reduce smog. And if you look at California, which has some of the highest gas prices in the country, they have very stringent standards. So this all drives up price. Not only are their fuel blends more difficult, it changes the way refineries do business. So they could be suspended. He could also suspend something called the Jones Act, which is sort of complicated, but it basically says that a tanker cannot go from a domestic port in the U.S. to another domestic port unless it is a domestically flagged, American flagged ship with American workers on it and it is built in America. So it really limits the mobility or the transfer of fuel within the country, especially in the Northeast where there have been a lot of refinery shutdowns because of regulations. So there are some things he can do immediately to begin driving down the price of oil and the price of gasoline, but it is a longer-term problem that speaks to our lack of energy policy.
And Dr. Travis, how do you feel about this? We saw that the St. Louis Fed just a few weeks ago put out a report saying that over the past decade, 15% of the oil price spikes was due to speculation. Do you think the president could be doing more on this issue?
Oh, I agree with you on this. I think he could be doing more, and he hasn't done more yet. And I think we go to Dr. McDonald in the polls, but I think it's going to be a big issue if he doesn't.
Dr. McDonald, the gas prices, is this something that is really going to stay with us?
Well, I mean, Obama just gave a speech a couple days ago on this topic, and so the administration is starting to get its word out there. And I don't want to be a mouthpiece for the administration at all, but they make the point that, look, domestic production, drilling is up significantly over his administration. Now, in context, some of those were decisions that were made before he became president, because that's sort of a long-term policy that you have to put in place to start that drilling and actually have the production come out of the well. But we have domestic production that's up. We actually have demand in the country that's down as well. So the sort of blends and other things that we're doing to try and encourage domestic production of alternative sources like ethanol, that's successful as well. So we're going in the right direction. The problem, is just in the long-term horizon. There's only so much oil in the world, and as other countries come online and become more of economic powerhouses, which is good because then the U.S. can sell products to them, and so it helps everybody in the world to have those countries move forward. But they also want to consume oil. And then you add on top of that Iran rattling its saber, although they don't appear to make any, be actually going to do anything at this point. There's been a lot of rattling, but no action. Still, that drives up even further this 15%. Yes. So, those are the conditions. So if you look in the long haul, we have to face the fact that one day the oil is going to run out. And we've got to prepare for that. And how do we best, in a country that is only 2% of the oil reserves in the country, but consumes 20% of the world's oil, how do we change that balance in the long run? And continuing to drill the 2% that we have is never, ever going to fully satisfy the demand that we have in this country for the oil. It may, in the short run, change some of the balance of supply and demand within the country, but in the long run, we've got to face this fact that we've got to change the way in which we produce our energy in this country.
But so in terms of the day-to-day, politics around energy, based on what you're saying, is the Republican Party or the right wing, are they lying? Are they grandstanding? I mean, what is...
Well, people always exaggerate. So, that's just sort of the norm in politics, which always makes it very frustrating for voters because they have to be consumers, good consumers, and take the bits and pieces here. Both sides have arguments to make that yes, we can expand our drilling even further. It will again change that sort of supply and demand balance equation a bit in the future. But in the long term, it's a short term. It's not even a short term. It's a medium term band-aid on a long term problem. Because again, one day we're not going to have any oil in this world, and so that's the day that we have to really prepare for now.
Mr. Holler, yeah, go ahead.
This 2% of the world's proven oil reserve, this is part of the grandstanding. Because proven oil reserve, this is a very technical term that does not speak to how much oil is actually in the ground in America. It is designed specifically to say, this is what we know we can extract right now. It does not mean, what's technically recoverable, what might be recoverable in the future. We've heard for a long time that we're going to be running out of oil within the next decade, and we keep finding more and more and more. So when President Obama goes out and says, we have 2% of the world's proven oil reserves, and we use 20%, it's intentionally misleading to make it seem like we're using much more oil than we have in the ground. America has vast supply. There's 200 years worth of supply of oil in the ground in America that, for various reasons, we choose not to use. And if you look at the administration's rhetoric, normally they'll talk about lessening our dependence on foreign oil. On occasion, they'll slip and talk about lessening our dependence on oil. When they rejected the Keystone Pipeline, they said it, and the president said it down in his speech when he was in Florida earlier this year. That is their goal, and it speaks to the doctor's point about weaning us off of oil because it's the fuel of the past. And the president's used those words before, that it's the fuel of the past. For anybody who's filling up their gas tanks, it's the fuel of the present, it's the fuel of the future. There might be hydrogen cars or something along those lines, or natural gas vehicles, and the infrastructure might pop up, and that's great. We certainly welcome all that. But to try to wean us off of oil prematurely, I think is harmful to the economy, and it's certainly harmful to the American people who are trying to live their daily lives.
And so, Dr. Travis, you look like you want to jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't know that it's premature, but I think it goes back to the other points about politics, that the president is pushing alternative energy sources as part of his economic plan, whether it's wind, solar, or something else. So it's all connected with him to promote other things.
Yeah, so from your perspective, the president essentially, it's a smokescreen then to
Yeah.
get to where he wants to be.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, if you listen to the rhetoric, and this is what I always enjoy about Washington, is people, especially on the Senate floor, they'll go down and give 30-minute speeches, and if you give enough 30-minute speeches, you're bound to contradict yourself at some point. and there was a great example of a senator from New Jersey, Senator Menendez. He was down on the floor earlier this week saying, only in Washington can you think taking away subsidies, and he was talking about this, $199 deduction that oil companies get part of when all other manufacturers in the U.S. get this too. He was calling it a subsidy, but he's saying, only in Washington could you think taking away the subsidy would raise gas prices. 2 weeks ago, he was down on the Senate floor, same exact place, saying we need to subsidize natural gas vehicles to make the cost go down so consumers can buy it. I mean, it's that sort of distorted logic that makes policy in Washington, and that's why voters are so frustrated, because they get those mixed messages and they can't make heads or tails of it.
We're going to take a quick break here on 2 half hours, and we're going to come right back and discuss more about gas prices, the economy, and other burning issues. All right, well, welcome back to the special election edition of 2 half hours. Now, before the break, we were discussing gas prices, a little bit about the economy, and Mr. Holler, you had said that President Obama was running sort of an end around here, a smokescreen on the issue of whether we had 2% of the proven oil reserves. Dr. McDonald, I wanted to go to you on this issue of long-term sustainability.
Right. So I was wondering what the right number is. If it's not 2%, what is the correct number? It's probably not 20%. And again, in the long run, we have to think about how we're going to, in 200 years or whatever, to have an economy that's not going to be run on oil. And I'll just, sort of an ironic point, if we're not drilling and everywhere else in the world is drilling, when that day comes when we're at 200 years from now, guess which country's going to be the only country that has oil left? It's going to be the United States. And so, in sort of ironic way, protecting what we have now puts us on a good path in the future, so that we can continue to manage our oil in a responsible way and in a sustainable way to supply our future consumers.
Is that out of touch with the American people, though, who need energy now?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think if you say, look, we have, and I think the number is something like 1.4 trillion barrels of oil between the U.S. and Canada that is available. It's not under this proven reserve category that the president likes to use. But if you say we have all this oil out there, but we're not going to drill it, so maybe in 100 years your great-great-grandchildren will still have some oil left. Yeah, that's a hard sell to make to the American people who are really hurting right now. And one of the reasons they're hurting is because of gas prices. That it's really interesting to think about. Think back 4 years ago. You had oil was at $150 a barrel, so gas in the U.S. is about $4 a gallon. We're almost at $4 a gallon now. Oil is not up at that $150 a barrel level. There's a gap here, and part of this is the regulations that's being put on the refineries and the refinery shutdowns that we're seeing in the U.S. So some of the gas price stuff is actually disconnected from oil prices just because of the regulatory burden that's been placed on us.
So if there's no problem then with drilling now, because the immediate need is now, then why don't we deficit spend to get our way out of the economic morass that we're in? Because the government's the only entity that can go in and supply economic stimulus during a downturn of the economy. What's so bad then about providing that deficit relief, that relief to the economy through deficit spending, and then bring it back in line after the economy recovers?
I think what you're trying to say is that deficit spending and presumably repaying it sometime in the future, that repaying it sometime in the future, you're trying to equate to technological innovation. There is a huge cost to running up more debt and deficit and placing that burden on a future generation. There is not a huge detriment to future generations on technological advances, which if we do need to bridge beyond oil at some point, will need. So I don't think you can compare the two.
Well, Dr. Travis, I want to come to you. It looked like you wanted to jump in on that. I don't want to
No,
cut
go
you
ahead.
off.
No,
You know, when we're talking about deficit spending, I think that's a good point, because we talk so much, and the Ryan plan, of course, has put this back in the news about the need to balance the budget sometime in the future to reduce the deficit. But one thing I want to get your thoughts on is, so often we refer to the credit rating agencies, the rating of the United States, but aren't these the same people that said Lehman Brothers had a AA or a AAA rating just the day before it collapsed? Should we be responding to these pressures in terms of how we cut and spend and different things like that, or should we be focused more on our fundamental needs?
Well, I think we've got to do both. I mean, I think we've got to watch the rising deficit, but we've also got to look at Wall Street, too. I think Wall Street, there are a number of problems that remain there in terms of regulation and who's doing what. I mean, the banks are doing fine in the economy. It's everybody else that's hurting.
Go ahead.
And the banks are in the position that they're in after the vaunted Wall Street reforms that were passed by Dodd-Frank and signed by President Obama that basically, codified too big to fail. I mean, all the problems that were discussed in the financial crash back in 2008, if you talk to a lot of people, the financial overhaul, which actually went ahead of President Obama's commission and wrote the bill before the commission was even done, make those problems worse. So I don't think that anybody really believes that Dodd-Frank fixed anything. If anything, it's made it more cumbersome and made the big banks stronger to the detriment of the smaller or medium or community-sized banks.
Well, Dr. Travis, you mentioned other things we can do. I mean, I don't know how you feel on Dodd-Frank if you want to say something about that, but what are different regulatory measures you think we could put in place to deal with Wall Street?
Well, I was thinking about the old Glass-Steagall Act. I mean, we now have banks and securities and we've commingled things that were separate after the Roosevelt years, and I'm not so sure that shouldn't be done again. I think we've got some consumer protections that are needed. We need financial literacy, too, for the public. I don't think the public understands half of what's going on with a bank anymore. I mean, I've been with the same bank, and it just keeps changing names. It's 4 banks back or something.
Yeah, and that's for sure. And the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I guess, is supposed to be bringing that about. Dr. McDonald, how do you see this in terms of the candidates as well? I mean, obviously Mitt Romney, very big with Bain Capital, and that was brought this issue of Wall Street and inequality back into the election campaign. How do you think that's going to weigh on how the American people are viewing the candidates?
Right. Well, it's important to think about the contrast that we're going to see once we get into this general election. Right now, what we're seeing is a debate primarily among Republicans during their nomination contest. And so the issues and the solutions to those issues are being all debated within sort of the conservative realm. When we get to the general election, which is starting to happen now, we're starting to transition into that. You can start seeing this in terms of the way in which Republicans are now coming out of the woodwork to endorse Romney. And if you just look at the math, really the clock has run out on the other candidates. It looks like Romney will be the nominee. So we are transitioning to the general election. And when we transition to that general election, the debate is going to shift from being among Republicans to being between Democrats and Republicans. And so it's going to be really important to see how that sort of education of the public emerges. And a couple issues, to go to your question directly about, say, Romney as the nominee, which I do think is going to happen. On health care, we have not a great contrast between Romney and Obama in terms of health care. Thinking it through about what will be that is a campaign issue. That would have to come from outside spending. It wouldn't come directly from the Romney campaign. It will confuse some voters because of that. In terms of his persona, political scientists who look at this, and I'm a political scientist, so I'll put on my dunce cap here and talk about it. We talk about moments of crystallization where somebody makes a very innocuous statement or a gaffe, but it reinforces a perception of a candidate as being someone perhaps out of touch or otherwise, how they feel about things.
Yeah, well, President Obama, gets a lot of support from Wall Street, too, so how come he's not perceived as being?
Well, I'm just saying, for Romney, he hasn't had one crystallization moment. He continues to have them. He has them time after time. And it just befuddles me because Romney ran for president in 2008. He should be a better candidate than this. So there's something about the messaging with the campaign, or allowing the candidate himself to make these verbal gaffes that just reinforce in the public's mind. He's become the butt of late night jokes. The point where you become the butt of late night jokes on this issue is where that issue is crystallized in the mind of the public. So I think it's troublesome for the campaign. The good news, though, I think for Romney is that, look, we've got the Olympics coming up this summer. People are going to turn off, and for better or worse, his campaign advisor is right that there is an Etch-a-Sketch moment here where people are going to forget about the primaries. They're going to get into the summer. They're going to forget about politics for a little bit, and then they're going to refocus when we get back into the fall. So there is a point there where Romney can figure out how to retool this campaign. And that's really the challenge that's being laid before him and his advisors, is how do you take this message that you've been perhaps unfairly portrayed because of the way in which you've been delivering yourself and presenting yourself, how do you retool that image for the general election? And as I said, the good news for his campaign is there's plenty of time here for him to make up that deficit that he's created here on his image and reintroduce himself to the American public this fall.
Mr. Holler, what about Republicans, though? I mean, the Etch-a-Sketch thing was big. I mean, we've seen Newt Gingrich, Rick Perry call Mitt Romney a crony capitalist. We've seen it. I mean, all the candidates have gone after him, obviously, for Obamacare, where, I mean, it seems like there's very little space. I mean, what is it really with Mitt Romney? I mean, it seems like he and President Obama are very similar.
Here's the thing that amazes me. If you think back to 2008, and sort of going into the primary weeds here and who won and who lost, Mitt Romney won Colorado in 2008 by 30 points because he was the conservative alternative to John McCain. This year, he lost Colorado by about 30 points to Rick Santorum because Rick Santorum was the conservative alternative to Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney is arguably running more conservative this time than he did in 2008. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. I don't think his people would disagree with that characterization. And so, I mean,
why does he change then, do you think?
Well,
I mean, or has he changed?
I think there has been a fundamental shift in the Republican Party, which I'm grateful for, that they've moved to a more conservative platform. I think the Tea Party forced them to do that in 2010, and it's a recognition that that's where their party's going, and they need to get there. And I think Mitt Romney will always have to deal with those questions, whether it's sort of the political posturing or whether he really means what he's saying. But I mean, there have been studies done that say, by and large, the promises that are made on the campaign trail, presidents tend not to go too far from that line. I mean, obviously, you see it sometimes.
So he doesn't really believe what he's saying, then?
No, I don't think anybody knows whether he believes what he's saying. What I'm saying is that the promises he's making on the campaign trail, studies have indicated sort of historically that that's the path that they're going to choose to govern. Now, the language may change come the general election, but by and large, I think the policies that are being laid out, the embrace of the Ryan budget, those sort of things, that's the sort of stuff you could expect from a President Romney, regardless of sort of what messaging he uses in the general election.
So do you think Republicans will be able to get behind him in the general election, or will there still be some lingering resentment?
I think ultimately you'll see people, start to fall behind him. And one of the things that I think is really different this time, and think back, going even further back to 2000, people got behind George W. Bush. They were excited he was a conservative. He got into the White House and started working with people like Ted Kennedy on No Child Left Behind, and doing some other stuff where people were saying, this isn't really conservative. We thought this guy was conservative, but they gave him the benefit of the doubt. Mitt Romney is not going to have the benefit of doubt from conservatives. So if he wants to hold together the Republican Party as a coalition, which you can almost make the argument that it is in some cases a coalition, he's going to have to govern the way he promised to govern.
Well, Dr. Travis, I want to go to you, just from your own view and people you're talking to, and I mean, I'm assuming you're talking to some Democrats. What about President Obama on the same side of the ledger? Because I think a lot of people who are sort of more of the base of the Democratic Party would argue that he has moved too far to the right and that he is too conservative, and the closeness between, say, Mitt Romney and President Obama is not a good thing because it's a sign that the whole political spectrum is shifting to the right.
Well, I think he does have a problem, but I think he'll move back more toward the middle in campaigning, just as Dr. McDonald said about the shift from the rhetoric.
Well, and Dr. McDonald, I want to get your take on this because this is something that we see often, especially amongst younger people who feel, either more disillusioned with politics or, my vote doesn't count, that kind of thing. They feel like the candidates just kind of say whatever you want to hear at any given particular time. How do you see this campaign in particular sort of impact? I mean, do you see how large youth turnout like we saw in 2008, or do you think this sort of etch-a-sketch, back and forth kind of rhetoric is really going to hurt people's trust in the political process?
Right. Well, right now what we're seeing is a Republican contest going on, but there's no Democratic nomination contest. So we get to look at all the dirty laundry that's being exposed on the Republican side. And we do see this issue where Romney has a problem with the conservative base. It's very clear in the polling, exit polling. It's very clear in the election results that we've seen to date that he has a problem with his conservative base. But he also has a problem with his moderate base because, and those are the voters that are supposed to be his core supporters. He's not exciting and energizing those voters either. So he wins a big state like Florida just because there are a lot of moderates there, but there's no one really contesting his vote while Gingrich and Santorum are splitting the vote otherwise. So his campaign has a couple of challenges that are facing it. And if you look at Obama, as I said, we don't get to see his dirty laundry right now because there's no nomination contest going on the Democratic side. But we can look at some of the survey evidence. So we know that a candidate, Obama, who is not a president, could be very idealistic in the way in which he presented himself to the public.
Do you think that will represent itself depending on who his candidate, who his opponent is, rather? Will he remold himself?
Well, President Obama is much more pragmatic because governing is not the same as being a candidate. And so you have to make sacrifices in order to govern. And people who are idealistic, like young people who don't quite understand yet how the political process works and how it's necessary to make these concessions to the other side in order to actually effectively govern a country, they're going to be disillusioned. And it'll be a challenge to then the Obama campaign to reinvigorate this core constituency. That's very important. And by the way, the gap in support between young people and old people for the political parties in 2010 was at an all-time high. So while we talk a lot about war on gender and everything else, there's this other very interesting dynamic that's happening in our politics where we're seeing a distinct age gap emerge. And so Republicans, on one hand, have to figure out how they're going to reach out to these young voters. And for Obama, it's going to be very important to make sure that he reinforces that excitement for his candidacy and make sure that they turn out to vote.
Well, Mr. Hawley, I want to go to you on this because, Congressman Ron Paul has really excited for the Republicans, the young people. I mean, when you watch the campaign rallies, it's almost all people, it seems like, under 27. He's getting this, big enthusiastic reaction at every college he goes to. Is this a good thing for the Republican Party? Because I know his foreign policy views, being against the war in Afghanistan, withdrawing from all U.S. military bases, are very controversial amongst many members of the Republican Party.
I would sum up his support as sort of a distrust of the establishment. I mean, there's no elected official, I think, in the country that better, embodies anti-establishment than Ron Paul. Whether that's your establishment, that's a bad thing. If you're anti-establishment, that's a great thing. But I think Republicans can learn a lesson from that in that, young people are inherently distrustful of what they consider authority figures. They don't want to be told what to do. Maybe it's because they think they have all the answers and they don't need somebody telling them what to do. Maybe that's the case, or maybe they just want the ability to learn on their own and make their own decisions. So I think what Republicans have to do, and speaking as a conservative, what we should be doing is saying, look, we're going to empower you to make decisions. And if you succeed, great. You're going to end up like, maybe you'll end up like Mitt Romney and be extremely wealthy and you'll go tout your success stories and be unabashful about your success. And if you don't succeed, well, there's a safety net to catch you briefly, bounce back up and try again. And I think that's really sort of the message that we need to have to young people is, look, we want to have an environment where you can, go out on your own, succeed, be who you are, and make a mark for yourself. We don't want you to be dependent on, your parents. We don't want you to be dependent on government. We don't want you to be dependent. You are an adult. Go make something of yourself and succeed. And I think that embodies, and maybe it's idealistic, but it embodies sort of the entrepreneurial spirit that the country was founded on. And I think the ability to tie that back in with young people who are so distrustful of authority figures, is what Ron Paul has been able to do.
Well, in a way, though, don't you think that Mitt Romney is the ultimate authority figure? I mean, him as the candidate, wouldn't that drive away some of Ron Paul's supporters?
It could, or if I think Mitt Romney is at his best when he is forthright about who he is. So if you watch the debates closely, you'll notice at times he says, look, I've been successful. I worked hard, and I was successful, and I'm not ashamed of it. And that sort of bold declaration saying, I'm not going to apologize for my success. I worked hard. I earned it. I think what people ultimately want is to know that they can go out and work hard and earn their success. And if he can tie it back and say, the government is stopping you is putting a ceiling on what you're able to do because of regulations pushing down the economy or driving up gas prices so you can't go find a job, whatever the case may be, and say, ultimately, my policies are designed to give you a springboard so you can go succeed. I think in that way, he can say, look, my policies are going to give you the chance to be like me. And ultimately, I think everybody wants to be successful in life. Nobody wants to be dependent in life.
Well, Dr. Travis, I want to come back to you because you're at George Mason University, very large college campus. What are you seeing on campus, the dynamics in the election? Is it exciting people?
Not much. They wanted to have Ron Paul there. they had to do a petition, and I don't know what happened to it. But that's who they were interested in. That's who caught their imagination. I mean, no one said, of the students I saw and talked to, that, oh, if we could get Mitt Romney here.
So do you think when the election season comes around in November, people aren't going to turn out?
I think there's going to be a huge drop-off on the youth vote. Dr. McDonald looks at the surveys far more than I do, but I think there are going to be a lot of stay-at-home people on the Republican side who just don't find Romney to be their candidate. They will remain at home. And the youth haven't been captivated by this unless Obama does something in terms of his campaign again.
Well, why do you think that is?
I think it's a disillusionment. I remember back in the Kennedy days, don't trust anyone over 35. And then all of a sudden people, or 30 I think it was, and then, some of the people in that era began to hit 31 and they said, oh my God, it's us, And they thought Obama was going to bring change, and he didn't, because of the institutionalization of how Washington really works. And they didn't understand, and they thought, he's the great hope, and it couldn't be done anyway, but not that fast in 4 years.
For sure. Dr. McDonald, I want to get your take on this. You said a little bit about it, but when we see sort of the polling of Ron Paul, and you can speak more authoritatively in this, when he comes up against President Obama, he doesn't really do as bad as you'd think. In fact, it seems a little better than some of the Republican primaries against the other candidates. So do you think if he's not the nominee, which I'll just assume that he won't be, that actually could be a very something that really impacts young voters?
No, I don't think so. I mean, Ron Paul, his support base in this primary is rather small if you look at the big picture of things, because we've got a very narrow electorate within the Republican Party, and he is energizing young people within that very small segment of the people who are engaged in the Republican primary. So it's difficult to say that a lack of a Ron Paul is somehow going to translate into something meaningful in terms of the general election. Could be more meaningful if he decides to run as a libertarian candidate, as a third-party candidate. And there are other potential. I mean, there's going to be some sort of American elect centrist party out there. Who knows if evangelicals may decide to rally around a candidate as well in opposition to Romney. I mean, there's a lot of dynamics that we have yet to see emerge in this cycle yet, and we'll have a much clearer picture once we get to the fall. So I don't know where we're going to be. One thing, though, that's interesting to me that the Obama campaign's doing, I think they realize that there's a challenge here to them to re-engage people. And so if you look at, actually, as I said, although there's nothing really going on the Democratic side, Obama's outspent all of the Republican candidates so far. He hasn't been doing it on advertising. He's building an infrastructure in this country to do a get-out-the-vote effort. And so he's investing heavily in putting campaign offices, putting staff together, reinvigorating that mobilization army that he had in 2008. And so we're going to have to see how that all plays out. I mean, there's recent, again, I'll put on my dunce cap and be an academic for a second, but recent studies show that sort of face-to-face mobilization effort is very effective at turning people out to vote. So I think the Obama campaign has bought into that, and they're going to put their eggs in that basket, and we're going to see how it plays out in the general election.
Now, Mr. Holler, I want to go back to you because you spoke about what Republicans need to do to try to appeal more to the youth. So it sort of suggested that there's a lot of work for them to do and that perhaps they are behind the eight ball a little bit when it comes to the president. Do you think that these are just focusing more on just the message, more ground campaign, as Dr. McDonald just pointed out? I mean, what is it that, say a Romney or a Santorum can really do in this short period of time to try to make that impact?
I think what has to happen is they have to be able to present a positive vision of the future. I think too many people in sort of the political game want to have a referendum on President Obama's record, which, that's one way to win an election, and his record should be scrutinized thoroughly. But they can't rely on that if they want to attract the youth vote. That's part of it, obviously, because they're going to say, youth are saying, where's sort of the hope and change I was promised, and they don't see it there. But maybe that just keeps them home. If you really want to get them, you need to say, this is the positive vision for the future that we're offering you. And it's what I said earlier. You need to say, America is not on the decline. We're not sort of receding in the world. Don't worry about that. We have a plan to revive the economy and show them how their future can be great. I think everybody looks at the future and says, well, this is terrible. America is changing, and we're never going to have a thriving economy again. And that's sort of like that's the depressed attitude. And you see this with President Obama's rhetoric too. He said earlier this week, basically saying high gas prices are a fact of life, and that's because the economy is recovering. And he's trying to create the structure that is, if we have a good economy, we have to have high gas prices. And that for Americans, again, who are filling up their cars every day, doesn't really sound right. It seems like you can't have both. And maybe you can't, maybe you can, but it's not an optimistic vision of the future. And I think what President Obama did so well was lay out an optimistic vision of the future. He hasn't delivered on it, but Republicans need to be able to seize that and say, we have a way to do it.
But isn't that,
go ahead.
Excuse me. Isn't that Romney's problem? I mean, he says, I'll fix it, but I never heard of any plan of what he's going to do. He just says Obama's plans don't work, so I'm going to fix it.
Mitt Romney needs to be able to convey what his plans are.
And he hasn't so far.
Right,
that's all I'm saying.
Right, he needs to figure out a better way to do that, and that's why there's so much speculation about Marco Rubio being his vice presidential nominee, is because that is somebody who can translate policy into that aspirational sort of goal that can help connect with people. And whether it's Marco Rubio, whether it's changing the message or learning how to talk about his plan better, they need to be able to do something along those lines.
Communication is going to be the problem, because the gaffes are going to come again, perhaps, I think.
Well, let me ask you this real fast, and we want to just finish up here. Do you think that the Ron Paul supporters will support the Republican nominee ultimately, or that they may vote for a third-party effort?
I think by and large, a lot of them will. There will always be people who will vote down the libertarian ticket no matter what, and that's fine. But I think a lot of them are going to say, recognize sort of the shift that's happened in the Republican Party and say, these are some pretty good goals that the Republican Party is standing behind now, and I can get behind them and I can make it work. And
so broker convention, yes or no?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Dr. Travis, I want to come to you. With the springtime coming back, there's some talk of a resurgent Occupy movement. Do you think income inequality could tip the scales for President Obama, or maybe take people out of the political process?
I think it might tip the scales for Obama, and I think it's clearly going to come back as an issue.
Dr. McDonald, what do you think here? Do you think income inequality could tip things for President Obama, or it could be something that could trip him up?
It already has. We changed the whole debate in the country from around deficit reduction to about how do you deal with this income inequality. So, it didn't fully change it, but it introduced a new voice into that debate, and so it's already affected the debate in the country. I just want to add on something about conservatives. And I don't think necessarily Romney will go with Rubio as a nominee for vice president. I think he has more flexibility than McCain did in reassuring conservative voters, because conservatives are going to rally against Obama, and there will be plenty of opportunities, maybe not directly from the Romney campaign, but through a super PAC or something else, that will be out there hammering Obama, and that's going to energize that base. And the way in which you win elections for president and for most states is to appeal to the center. So Romney's his problem, I think, on the conservative side is going to fix itself just because Obama's the nominee, but he really needs to figure out how he's going to reach out to these independent, moderate voters, because those are the ones that Obama did very well with in 2008. By all indications, he's doing well with them right now, and nothing that's happened within this nomination contest has assuaged any concerns that those voters have about Republican policies. So that's where he needs to go. And so I think more of like a Kasich or a Christie or somebody like that. At least I think Romney has more opportunity than McCain did. McCain had to really appeal to that conservative base.
So what's the key issue? Just
Romney
the final question here. The key issue that President Obama needs to focus on to be successful.
Well, it's going to be the economy. Inevitably, it's going to be the state of the economy. All these other things are going to matter on the margin, but overall it's going to be the economy.
Dr. Travis.
No, I'd say the economy and watching Europe so that our economy remains stable if there's a slip in Europe somewhere.
Mr. Holler.
It's a lot of it's going to be the economy, and I think gas prices are the major subset of that.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys all so much. That's going to wrap things up here on the special elections edition of 2 Half Hours. I want to thank once again Drs. Travis and McDonald and Mr. Holler for joining us here today. You've heard plenty. Tell us what you think. Send us your comments, suggestions. Will Mitt Romney lock up the Republican nomination? Will gas prices trip up President Obama? Can smaller parties break through to the mainstream? Join us next week as we look into the crystal ball here on 2 Half Hours with me, Eugene Puryear, from Washington. Till next time.